Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 5 of Let's Talk About Sweat. In this episode, David and I just finished up a great conversation about...
Well, we think it's great.
Well, we think it's great. Yeah, you be the judge. About how prevalent excessive sweating is, how prevalent hyperhidrosis is, because basically we've kind of been on a soapbox about this for quite some time since starting Carpe. We didn't realize how common of an issue this is for so many people. And that's one of the reasons we've been growing Carpe. You know, it was going to just be a single hand antiperspirant, and then it's grown into this company that's meant to help with excessive sweating all over for all sorts of people suffering from excessive sweating. And the reason we're doing this podcast is because we think there are so many of us for whom this is a problem. So in this episode, we talk about that. Let's jump to the embarrassing sweat story. This week, it's me. So this is a common one. I think this is something that a lot of people have experienced. Once again, there's a girl, because there's always a girl in my sweat stories forever, for whatever reason.
That's surprising.
Yeah. So this was senior year of high school. This was actually, we had this little party, this backyard party, to celebrate the end of the school year that one of my friends was throwing, and like everybody was there. And it got pretty wild. And so we were all spending the night there. His house had a few bedrooms, so we were all like squished together in a few beds. And in the bedroom with me was this girl who I was interested in. And so we were going to be together in this bed. Not that anything was going to happen, but I was still hoping to make a good impression. Anyway, I was wearing Sperry's that day. So they were, I don't know if are Sperry's still common?
Yeah,
people
boat shoes.
Yeah. It was like the thing that everybody had to wear back then. So basically, no socks on, just my feet in these boat shoes, and my feet got really sweaty that day. And they had been getting sweaty in these shoes for a while, so it'd been like kind of accumulating. And I remember we're in that small bedroom that night, and I take off my shoes, and it was probably one of the worst smells I'd ever smelled, and it was just exacerbated by the size of that room. And she did not acknowledge me all night. I think there was like 2 other people in that bedroom, and I didn't care about their opinions. They were also probably unhappy. Nobody brought it up, but it was like I could barely breathe. And if I could barely breathe, I'd been like tolerating that smell slowly all day. So they were probably, I don't know if they slept.
You had a tolerance for it already.
Yeah. Hey, if anybody was there with me that night and is listening to this, I'm very sorry for what happened. But that's the problem with sweaty feet. That's the problem with, our embarrassing excessive sweat. Which we're talking a lot about in this episode. So without further ado, let's talk about sweat. Oh, also, send your embarrassing sweat story to mystory@mycarpe.com.
mystory@mycarpe.com.
Hey everybody, I'm Casper.
And I'm David, and we were 2 sweaty guys who started Carpe.
We met in college, we connected over our sweaty hands, and we've spent the past few years thinking about sweat, researching sweat, and working on sweat solutions.
So join us each week, and let's talk about sweat.
All right, welcome back everybody. Today, David and I are going to be talking about something that I think we've got a bit of a different perspective on than most people. So basically, when we started Carpe in 2014, one of the things that we realized is that so few people realized how big of a problem excessive sweating was. And I think, I don't think we realized how big of a problem it was.
Yeah, I mean, you look at studies and the literature and all of these papers that are talking about the prevalence of, quote unquote, hyperhidrosis. And early studies put it at like 0.6 to 1%. And that just didn't make sense. Like for me, I had really sweaty hands. I had never even heard of hyperhidrosis. I also got really sweaty feet. I sweated everywhere, and more than most. And just like in high school and looking around and even in college, I would see other people who were experiencing a similar thing to me, and the numbers just didn't add up.
I mean, so let's take it back to when we were getting started, right? Because we're getting started with Carpe in 2014, and I remember at the time, I think we knew about what hyperhidrosis was, but we thought that it was so small that it was, like you said, like some studies in the late 90s were showing 0.6% of the population that, hey, this isn't what our product is going to address because it's so rare. We were thinking there's a bigger portion of people who, occasionally get sweaty hands.
Yeah, we were thinking about like the person that goes on the date or a meeting or to an interview or the athlete and the average Joe that gets overly sweaty. What we found over time, and that what we didn't expect.
Well let's not get there yet. That's getting ahead of the story. To set the stage, So 2014,
I was trying to make it a
we're out there.
3-minute episode.
I know. We I don't think that's going to be possible with this one. We actually have a lot to say on this topic. We were out there in 2014, and we started talking to people about this idea. As we started working on the formula, started talking to investors, advisors, other entrepreneurs, kind of to learn what it would take to make a hand antiperspirant and actually launch it on the market. And so much of the feedback we were getting was that there's not that many people for whom sweaty hands are a problem, right?
Yeah, well, most people were just like, why would anyone buy this? And I'm like, I would buy it. I need it. And they're like, well, you're probably the only one. And it was just amazing to me how no one saw such a massive problem that for me and for Casper felt like it was so apparent. And mostly because, we lived through it, and we also notice it in everyone else that we see that's swiping their hands off or offering a sweaty hand to us. So it was unbelievable that people didn't realize it was a problem.
Yeah.
And still don't. Most people still don't understand, A, the gravity, and B, the prevalence of the problem. It's so big.
I think that's, I think it's changing, but that might be just because of where we are, because we surround ourselves with sweat and the sweat world.
It's definitely changed significantly over the past couple of years.
When we were back there in 2015, so summer of 2015 is when we started selling Carpe hand antiperspirant online. And we were thinking, kind of the few ads we were running were all about, hey, if you get sweaty hands before meetings, before dates, give this a try. And then I think you were alluding to this earlier, we start seeing the reviews on Amazon, and people are saying, I've had hyperhidrosis for decades, and this is the first thing I found that's helped me actually conveniently manage the excessive sweat.
Right. Yeah. So right after we launched Carpe, and we actually got our very first investment, which allowed us to, run studies and do our first manufacturing run, from 3 guys who just searched on Amazon and looked at search traffic for sweaty hands and stop sweaty hands and sweaty palms and sweaty feet and stop sweaty feet. And they realized that people are looking for this, and there aren't really solutions for it. And so that's what gave them the confidence to actually put money in and to partner with us, which was really cool. Versus everyone else who was like, this isn't a problem. They just looked at search traffic and realized that people were looking for solutions for this problem. So
yeah, there were a couple small solutions out there for sweaty hands, but they were really bad. And I think I was talking about this in the last episode. It's all about commercial incentives. All the companies were thinking this isn't a problem. And now, Carpe's out there, a lot of people are buying it, and people are starting to realize, oh, wait, there is a lot of demand for a convenient, effective solution to sweaty hands.
So what Casper is saying is, after we launched on Amazon and we had this thinking that we were going to be selling to golfers and tennis players and, people going on meetings. Yeah, professionals, right? Situational sweating, nervous sweating. And we started reading all of the reviews, and everyone who was really passionate and excited were people that were saying they had hyperhidrosis. They've been looking for solutions for so long, and this has been the only thing that's worked for them. They've tried prescription solutions. They've tried everything their dermatologist has recommended, and nothing has worked until Carpe, and it's completely changed their life. And it still took a long time to understand who really wanted these products, because we went into it with
thinking that there's not that much demand for
because of what the literature and all of the papers said. But all of these people were coming out of the woodworks that didn't get included in those studies.
Right. So what the studies have found since, there was a study that we'd missed initially that in the early 2000s found a 2.7%, 2.8% prevalence rate, something like that. Yeah. And then a study came out in 2016 after we were already saying it's about 5%. And I know the International Hyperhidrosis Society after that released a study showing that they think it's 20% among teenagers, and another study showing that in 95% of cases it doesn't improve. You don't grow out of it.
It's chronic.
It's chronic, right? So, all this kind of goes to show the numbers sort of went from 0.6 to 3 to 5 to probably 20 now.
Yeah, and one of the things that never made sense for to us from the very beginning when you look at the literature was that you had this U.S. literature, these papers that were saying 0.6 to 1% and then 3%, and then later on 5%. But when you looked at international prevalence rates in similar papers around the similar, the
Germany
same time,
and some countries in Asia,
it ranged from 14 to 20%.
Right.
Right. So it just didn't make sense. Like, what's so different about someone in Germany or France or Canada or China and someone in the U.S. when it comes to sweating?
So I think we sort of, what happened here is, so we discovered it through a few pathways. We discovered it just through seeing what was happening with Carpe sales. Like, people were actually lining up to buy Carpe, and they were talking about hyperhidrosis, and we realized, okay, this is much more common than most people realize. The study started catching up. We started hearing also from customers that it's not just sweaty hands, but there's also they don't feel like they have effective solutions to excessive sweating of the armpits, feet, other areas. So I mean, that's when we started broadening Carpe, but that's also starting to look at the research when we realized this is a problem all over, right? Like excessive sweating all over the body. Whether or not you call it hyperhidrosis. So that's like the next thing that I kind of wanted to get into is I feel like one of the reasons that the official number has gone up is because I think labeling it hyperhidrosis used to be very uncommon, and now it's become a much more common label. And I don't know. I was trying to think of a good
most people.
for this.
So I mean, based on one of the studies, the overwhelming majority, like well over 60% of people with hyperhidrosis, have never heard of it before, don't know what it is, and don't think that they have it. So they've basically, based on how they've responded to certain survey questions about their sweating, would be characterized as having hyperhidrosis, and they are saying they've never heard of it, they don't know what it is, and they don't think they have it. So to Casper's point,
I think the other thing in those studies that was interesting is the doctors were in the same boat. They didn't realize that excessive sweating was there was a possible pathology.
And that's been so frustrating for a lot of people with excessive sweat, hyperhidrosis, whatever you want to call it. Just you sweat a lot because you go to the dermatologist, and I heard a lot of this at the International Hyperhidrosis Society conference a couple years ago. All of these people were sharing stories of them going to their dermatologist from a young age and describing their excessive sweat and how it was destroying their quality of life. And the dermatologist, the doctor, is saying, "Oh, you'll grow out of it. Oh, it's just puberty." And to Casper's point, the understanding and knowledge of the understanding and knowledge of what hyperhidrosis is and how it works and how it impacts people wasn't just kind of lost on those that actually had it, but it was also lost on actual doctors and dermatologists because it wasn't being taught in medical school, wasn't being taught or talked about in residencies. So they were telling someone who has a chronic lifelong condition that they'll grow out of it. And that was really that's really demoralizing for a lot of people. And so those were some of the stories that these people at the International Hyperhidrosis Society were sharing. It was really cool.
So I want to put a flag on that. Like you mentioned, it wasn't being taught in medical school. Episode 2, we spoke with Dr. Bhatti, and he was saying as a dermatologist, when he started in like the 90s, I think, they didn't really even talk about it. They didn't talk about primary hyperhidrosis. They acknowledged the existence of hyperhidrosis, this condition of excessive sweating, but they only really looked for it as a symptom of a secondary underlying symptom of an underlying pathology like heart disease or something, right? So like primary focal hyperhidrosis, that's really only started to be acknowledged in a big way, like David said, in the past 20 years, but people have been suffering from it for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and I mean, over the past several years, problems, if there's a big problem that pains a lot of people, it will eventually come out, right? And people will eventually recognize it. And no, just like acne in the 80s was not seen as this big problematic issue. But now, every company is working on stopping acne and helping to prevent acne. So it became something that people recognized was a problem because finally the voices of those that were pained by it were finally listened to, heard, and acted upon. And so that's what we've really had the pleasure and honor of being involved in, which is just raising awareness. And that's what we hear from a lot of people, just how thankful they are that we're talking about sweat, that we have this podcast, let's talk about sweat, because for so long our voices haven't been heard, haven't been recognized, and haven't been acknowledged or acted upon. And so, with us and with other companies that are starting to really focus on sweat and try our best to solve the problem of sweat, that awareness is growing, and that's exciting to see. And I know it's helping a lot of people not feel as alone, because most people with hyperhidrosis feel like they're on this island and that they're the only person with it. you talk to someone who's had sweaty hands their entire life, and it seems like they're like the only person. It just impacts me
to
because
this day.
it's
I mean, we speak with customers who think they're very alone,
Yeah.
and we speak to so many of them. So none of them are really alone. I don't know. Maybe we should do something to connect these people. We'll think about that. The fact that it's only been 20 or so years that we've really been talking about primary focal hyperhidrosis might be one of the reasons that there's still this uncertainty about where we draw the line between, what's hyperhidrosis, what's, normal, I guess not hyperhidrosis, but it's still excessive sweating and it bothers you. I think that's, an unnecessary distinction. That's why I like to talk about all of it as excessive sweating, right? Because there's definitely cases that nobody in their right mind would say that's not hyperhidrosis. There's people who are dripping buckets from their hands all day. And then there's a spectrum all the way down to people who, don't mind their sweating at all. And like we mentioned in episode 1, one of the interesting things about hyperhidrosis is it's not currently being defined as how much volumetrically sweat you're producing. It's defined by how much the excessive sweat bothers you, because it varies from person to person, perception, culture, what is too much sweating for you. So I think, what I like to talk about is excessive sweat in terms of, is there too much sweat? Is it bothering people? Is it causing people pain? And I think even if we say like, okay, now hyperhidrosis has had its say to some degree, like we're talking about hyperhidrosis, that's good. I still don't think we're recognizing how much sweat interferes in daily life beyond, even when it's called hyperhidrosis. And I think one of the things that made me realize that is when we were talking last episode about how relatively new antiperspirants are. Like antiperspirants started 100 years ago, right? And it's not like sweat didn't bother people before, because they were putting underarm shields in their, under their dresses to prevent the sweat from soaking through. And that's just like such a horrible way to do it.
Did you try those underarm pads one time?
Yeah, I've tried them because they still sell them. We were wondering like, oh, maybe this is something that Carpe should get involved in. It's not. It's horrible. They're not comfortable.
Well, they like fall off, right?
Well, they fall off. I mean, there's some companies that sew them into clothes, and I mean, some people like that, so that's good. But some other folks have told me that they don't like that feeling. It gets kind of bulky. So, I mean, if you can actually stop the sweat, I think that's the best way to do it. So we did that kind of for underarms, I think, and then there's 100 years ago, and I think it might be time right now.
Oh, you say we, like
we as in humanity. Yeah, sorry. Right. Like humanity, we as a species, I think really started tackling underarm sweat and stopping that interfering in our daily lives in a huge way 100 years ago. And I say started because to this day, I mean, I think there's still a space for better and better underarm sweat solutions, especially for people who sweat, a ton, excessive sweating in the armpits.
I mean, you look at the data, like over 70% of people aren't satisfied with their existing product.
Yeah, exactly,
right?
exactly.
Even if you don't have hyperhidrosis, like there's still so many people that just are not satisfied with the efficacy of their product, and there's so much improvement, there's so much work to be done, and there's a lot more efficacy that we can deliver, which is exciting. It speaks to two facts, and this is why I think awareness of excessive sweat, hyperhidrosis is so important, because one, people feel alone, and so recognizing, building awareness and letting people know that they are not alone, they're not on an island, they have a community, really key. That's really important. The second is the overwhelming majority of people with excessive sweat anywhere don't know that there are solutions or treatments available. Yeah. So they don't know to look online or to search. They don't know to go to a dermatologist because there have never been solutions. For the most part, historically, there haven't been solutions for them. So they don't know to look. They don't know to ask.
That's the real problem, right?
Right.
The real problem, I think, is, so now solutions are starting to come around. The real problem is because we don't realize as a society how big of a pain point this is for so many people. We don't talk about it, and so people who suffer from it don't think that
they don't know that
they don't know that there's something they can do about it.
Yes,
right? Exactly. So people need to realize, and doctors I think have started realizing. I think more people need to realize that, hey, if this is something that bothers them, this is something that they can do something about.
And it doesn't have to mean like you have this clinical diagnosis of hyperhidrosis. A lot of it is just you sweat more than you want to, right? And there are solutions now available for that. I think that's key.
So I think what's funny is, as a society, I guess before antiperspirant started, this is something that I was learning from those ads that I was researching. People were putting up with sweat ruining like very fancy clothes because there was nothing they could do about it. Right now, I mean, if you remember Jess's embarrassing sweat story from a few episodes ago, people are putting up with sweat ruining shoes. Like there's nothing they can do about it. And
putting up with it, I mean, being upset about it.
Being upset about it, but it's like, well, we a lot of people think there's nothing they can do about it, and there is. Like we can,
Right.
we've got effective foot antiperspirants available. I think there's other things, like some people do iontophoresis for their feet, so there are ways to reduce foot sweating in effective ways.
Yeah.
But as a society, like I don't think we talk about that. We just make jokes about ruining shoes and smelly feet, and it's like, oh well.
There's also like on the awareness front and the education side of things, there's this weird kind of dichotomy where on one hand you have people who acknowledge they have hyperhidrosis, know it by name, call it by name,
Yes.
and want other people to know it by name and want us to call it hyperhidrosis and talk
Right,
about
yes,
hyperhidrosis more. But then on the other side, you have people that could very well have hyperhidrosis. They sweat excessively and they want something and they probably don't know that there's solutions available, et cetera, et cetera. But they don't want that label of this clinical diagnosis of hyperhidrosis.
And who's to say? I mean,
and it's not to say that they have hyperhidrosis,
but I hear them both, right? Because on one
exactly.
hand, like the people who are saying, I want hyperhidrosis to be talked about, I think what they mean is, and I mean, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but basically, hey, this has been neglected my entire life. Now there's a name for it, and I want people to use that name. I want people to acknowledge that this is a problem. And I think on the other side, people are saying, hey, this is a problem for me, but I don't think it's something that needs to be clinicalized, right? Like this isn't going to kill me.
For them, I think it seems scary.
It seems a little scary to put a name
It's
like
like,
hyperhidrosis
I don't
on
want a
it.
disease.
Yeah.
Like,
And I think both of those things are fine. Like,
enough diseases.
I mean, yeah, I would probably say you have to call it by a disease name if it's going to kill you. But if it's not going to kill you, like, I think which it won't, call it whatever you want. I mean, it's not, it's not dangerous. It's just...
Yeah, I think on the...
Like, it makes you uncomfortable. It damages your life in that way. So why do we want to exacerbate that for you, right?
Yeah, well, I think on the side of people who, want it to be labeled hyperhidrosis, it's because of this underlying neglect by the larger portion of society who have said for their entire lives that this is not a problem, and you'll grow out of it.
Right.
And what do you mean sweat impacts your life? Everyone sweats,
Right.
and they don't get it, right? Which is why I think that group of people really want it to be labeled as something, because it's like, this is a problem and this is painful, and I think kind of calling it by its name, hyperhidrosis, helps others recognize, hey, this is actually something.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's exciting is we've come a long way in the past 100 years. So with antiperspirants, one of the things that was discouraging is it only started 100 years ago, but it's really slowed down in the past 50 years.
Yeah.
And I think it's starting to pick back up.
Since the 70s. as
Right.
we talked about.
With our understanding of excessive sweating, I feel like it started maybe 150 years ago, and it's really been picking up pace recently.
Yeah.
So 100 years ago, when the first antiperspirants came out, the American Medical Association was saying this could be dangerous, like reducing sweat could be dangerous. And funny enough, this is still a rumor I sometimes hear around, like it just lingered in society. Is reducing armpit sweat dangerous? No, it's not. There's been decades-long studies showing that it's not dangerous. The Alzheimer's thing came up in like the 50s, 60s. A lot of studies showing that was actually that originated out of a misinterpretation of data, thinking that Alzheimer's was caused by aluminum deposits, and then they found that it's not. There's no aluminum associated.
We should actually.
We should do an
there's
episode
this
about this.
huge misunderstanding that's honestly driven by the naturals trend, because these natural deodorants try to bash active ingredients, so aluminum salts, for being dangerous by saying, no aluminum free, aluminum's harmful.
It's exacerbated by that, because I think it's a misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding.
It's a fundamental misunderstanding that was then exacerbated
because it's an easy marketing message.
Because it's an easy marketing
saying
message.
no aluminum,
it's
like you don't have to
it's fear-mongering,
you can say no aluminum without having to prove that aluminum is dangerous. Which, by the way, like it's not. We can do an episode about this if people have questions.
Yeah, so we should
definitely
definitely do an episode on.
But the problem is, like,
aluminum salts and breast cancer and Alzheimer's, which have both come up, which aren't true.
Exactly. And I mean, in the scientific world, it's hard to say something is definitively not true, but up to the standard of science, review by the European Safety Commission that just came out last year, reviewing all of the data to date, they're like, this is safe. So don't want to go down that tangent, but the point is, like, even with that, there's still a lot of misinformation, still a lot of confusion. That all started out of this feeling of like, is this something that is okay to mess with? Is this okay to reduce sweating? And now we know that it is. And furthermore, I mean, so we know that it's okay to reduce underarm sweating. I think in the past 30 or 40 or 50 years is when we really started understanding the difference between emotional and psychological sweating. And I almost wanted to do this episode about emotional sweating, because I've been reading papers about this for weeks now. But I feel like we can get some scientists on the show to talk about it better than we can. And so I want to wait until we can get an interview with one of those. But point is, we're starting to realize that this whole thermoregulatory sweat happens all over your body. You don't really want to mess with that. And you want to enable that to happen. That's what helps keep humans functioning cool. That's one of the reasons that humans are as good as they are at running and everything, as Andrew Best was telling us a couple episodes ago. Quick side note about that. Thermoregulatory sweat, if you do inhibit it in some way, if you wear clothes that are too hot or whatever, your body will compensate and just sweat more. So like your body is pretty resilient with its thermoregulatory sweating. But then we have this emotional sweating, which it's so interesting when you look at the research. It's so hard to disentangle them and understand what's driving one and what's driving the other, because they're using like a lot of this. They're using the same sweat glands, they're using the same neural pathways, but they're clearly different. Like they're lighting up different regions in the brain, different parts of your body sweat. There's this one famous paper, I think from the 70s is when they really started researching this well, that's showing that, people get hot, their forearm sweats, people get stressed out, their palm sweats, but their forearm sweats less actually. And vice versa, I think. And so I think that's also opening the door to recognizing that, hey, so this emotional sweat, which is primarily hands, feet, underarms, and forehead, that's not something that if we interfere with, that's going to somehow hinder our ability to function as best we can as humans. And this is one thing that I've been emailing a lot of researchers with a pretty simple question. A lot of people have looked into this issue of like emotional sweating. Where did it come from? Why do we have it? And Andrew Best, he told us like it evolved before thermoregulatory sweating probably.
Right.
And there's this great study, I think out of the 70s, showing that if you block sweating on the paws of certain animals, they're going to start slipping around more on a treadmill. But if they can sweat a little bit on their paws, they have that ideal traction. And then there's this great guy I hope we talk to next month who's done studies showing that basically when humans are gripping things, like the perfect amount of sweat results in the perfect grip. And just like a tiny bit less sweat, not as good of a grip. Too much sweat, as you all know, if you've ever had like sweaty hands and dropped something, also a bad equilibrium. So clearly, like we have this weird deregulation with emotional sweating where a lot of us sweat too much emotionally, like our hands get too sweaty. It doesn't serve a functional purpose. And I'm emailing all these researchers and I'm asking, do we have a theory as to why humans sweat too much? And most of them kind of laugh it off, like Andrew did, I think, when we asked him this. It's like, oh, there's a lot of things like this in human evolution where we have something that we evolved that's not really that useful. And in this case, it seems to be that we emotionally sweat too much. There's no real purpose to all this excessive sweating in the hands, feet, underarms, and forehead. And for that reason, if we have effective ways of controlling it, we should, if it's causing us pain, right? So I think that's something that 100 years ago, we couldn't have said as easily as we do right now. 100 years ago, we might have said like, hey, maybe we shouldn't try to reduce our sweaty feet. Maybe there's a reason it keeps us alive. And right now, I think we can say pretty confidently, no, sweaty feet just suck. Like if we can stop sweaty feet, let's stop sweaty feet. So I think there's a lot of things conflating here. And I think now is a pretty exciting time because, we're realizing how many people suffer from all these conditions. We're starting to see effective treatments. And we're also really starting to see results of decades of research showing that, hey, there's nothing wrong with treating this. This is something that you should try to stop if it's bothering you.
100%. Could not agree more.
That was a long rant.
I think I loved it. Big takeaways, wrapping this conversation up. There are a lot of people out there who sweat excessively, don't know that there are solutions available, don't know that there are people like us that are working to solve the problem. And we want to make sure that they know we're here for them. And you, listeners, who are also sweaty people, we want y'all to make sure that you let those people know you're there for them too. Because ultimately, awareness allows us to build communities and to come together to support each other in our mutual shared problems and also to help develop the best solutions and products to solve those needs. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is if you do sweat a lot and you're listening to this now, know that you are not alone. We're right here. We sweat a lot. There are a lot of other people that share in your sweat and know the pain. So you're not alone, and we're all here for each other. So this has been a really fun episode for me. Casper, did you have anything else that you wanted to touch on today?
I just definitely want to reiterate what David said. I think people aren't going to realize that they're not alone unless we all speak up. So, if excessive sweat bothers you, if you see somebody else suffering, let them know. I mean, get involved in these groups, because I think the more that we let other people know that this is something that a lot of us struggle with, the more okay a lot of people are going to feel. The less alone, the less isolated a lot of people are going to feel. And I think that is one of the most helpful things we can do for each other.
And that is exactly why every week, let's talk about sweat.
Yeah, we'll see you next week, and we'll talk about sweat.
Thanks so much.
Take care.